we have Rachel from Armstrong, Craven. Rachel, I will let you introduce yourself and get started.
Perfect, thank you. You'll hear me okay? So hi everyone, delighted to be here. I need to get out of zone TI because I could talk about that for days and days, and into succession planning. So for those of you that can't see, because I know I'm in the way, so you can't see around corners, there's not lots of slides because I try and make this as interactive as possible, and actually it's more of a round table discussion that's going to set the conversation going, hopefully. So what I wanted to talk to you all about today was the role that TA should be and increasingly could be playing in leadership succession. So first of all, just for those of you that don't know us, and thank you again to Teresa, which I've greatly missed actually from AC, but so for those of you that we don't know, we are a talent mapping, talent pipelining and insights company, so we work with businesses right across the globe, doing a lot of the work as an external that Teresa talks about, but also partnering directly with talent acquisition teams. Essentially it's the extension with the extra manpower when you need to switch on, switch off. So that's Armstrong Craven, but really today is all about talking about where does TA sit and where could it sit in succession planning. So the first few slides, just on the first few stats, really is just, these are really well-known stats. These are kind of the scare stats that you see when you're looking at succession planning, particularly from CEO down. So whether it's your PwCs, huge rate, this is pre-pandemic, highest rate of CEO turnovers since records began. The scary one there, 53% of global companies don't have a contingency plan for succession. That was a survey of 4,000 board members. So these, this is a big deal, and it's probably, and as I said, it's kind of widely publicised. That stat about the C-suite, the badly managed CEO and C-suite transitions in the S&P 1500, that 1 trillion figure, a lot of that was the bit of a car crash back in 2013 from the Microsoft disaster. So they had a retirement, they went to market, it flopped, and then they've got the best ever brilliant internal hire. But the whole thing was just a nightmare. So that's the kind of high level CEO down. What we did through the back end of last year was we did a series, oops, I know how to do that. Here we go. We had a series of boardroom sessions with CHROs, Chief People Officers, through September through to December. We talked to about 34 Chief People Officers in London, in Boston, in New York. And what was on their mind, and just sort of giving the extra colour to all of this, when the topic of discussion was this question, so getting them CHROs to think about how your organisation's now thinking, particularly post-pandemic, or in the middle of the pandemic maybe still, of leadership succession, the risk, how are your businesses doing in this, are you changing your attitudes to it, particularly looking at, obviously, increased focus on DE&I, with the pandemic lens, and actually with things like the macro level, so globalisation, digitisation, ESG and so on. Is this impacting the way your organisations are thinking? And it was really interesting, so much kind of uniformity across London, New York, Boston in terms of what was on the minds, what's keeping the Chief People Officers awake. And I think there's this big realisation that post-pandemic, the leadership skills they've got in place aren't fit for purpose anymore. That whole command and control way of leadership isn't right anymore. We need empathetic leaders, we need high EQ, we need leaders who can be agile, turn on a dice, manage through crisis and so on, and you know what, we don't have those in our organisation, so that's a big challenge. We know we need to change this talent up and out. They were also thinking about high attrition, the phrase Great Resignation. I'm sure you've all heard before. I can't stand it, but certainly in the US it was a big thing. Now what that was doing is it was making unexpected holes in what they thought was a really good succession plan, and all of a sudden somebody had left who was key in that succession plan. Big holes again. How do we replace that? And then looking again at if we're going to start being clever at trying to broaden skill sets out and move people around the organisation more, how do we then backfill the hole? Well, whatever we do with talent, there's always a hole that we're going to leave behind. And then finally, the other thing that was big on their mind is DEI. So how do we use succession planning to increase that DEI representation? And again, if we're looking purely internally and we're looking kind of linear in a succession plan is wait for that person to leave and then I'm promoted up into that role, nothing ever changes. So all of this, as we were sort of doing all this talking, was increasingly leading to external talent and therefore that connection with TA. So what I'm interested now, I ask you guys that same question, are you seeing any difference? Are you sort of hearing more about succession planning? I'll read that out to you, I don't know if you guys can see. So how is your organisation thinking differently about succession planning and why? Has anyone sort of had any comments or any thoughts on that?
This is really key in EDF at the moment, and something that I think for the first time TA resourcing are not at the table but driving it. Yeah. So in the key business units we've got some real vulnerabilities. Thankfully, not thankfully, the worst happened in one of our projects at the back end of last summer, which was a great hook for me to jump on just this and to build a critical role plan from a support perspective. Obviously, I can't influence the internal bit, but what we can do is when we get that call, which is always happens on a Friday or over the weekend, and we have to hit the emergency button, what does that plan look like and how do we deploy it quickly? And I can lean into what happened in the summer to be able to get the.
So you're already seeing that connection starting to happen with.
They never want to go back to where they were.
Yeah. And for any else in the room, does that kind of resonate? Is succession planning more and more on the kind of vocab?
We're very vulnerable because we are a managing consultancy, and we have like consultants into our clients, and we have had once again, we had to push an emergency button, and because you're on a statement of works, there's no time for that change, and that's all absorbed by our costs as a business. Yeah. So it's really important. So I'm kind of doing that at like a real granular level at the moment, but really interested to hear how. Yeah, it is. I think it's making HR think more broadly about their own landscape now. This was always a kind of, it's a CEO conversation with the chief people officer, and then it was sort of, right, where's the C-suite, where are your succession plans, always internally focused.
One of the key questions that came up last summer when things went wrong was that we have succession plans, but they're not validated and they're not honest. So when the worst did happen, somebody dusted off the succession plan and went, oh no, and put it away again. So that has helped to drive some real kind of honesty and authenticity in that.
So it's the same person on so many different succession plans.
Yeah,
The same person leaves. It's not
but they
one
left
off,
6 years ago and nobody's thought about it. Yeah.
It's interesting though, it's like Teresa's point earlier around like assuming that they know nothing, right? So these leaders are not thinking about talent or the lifetime value. So when we get like 2,500 vacancies, right, and I'm saying, so am I here to hire bums on seats, or am I actually here to hire the pathway to partnership, right? And the business doesn't actually know. They don't care. I'm like, okay, so we have so much attrition after 3 years. So you've invested all of this time in qualification routes, to shore up another competitor in terms of that talent. And actually, I think sometimes an organisation doesn't actually look end to end. So why are we actually, why do we exist doing the jobs that we're doing? This is the question I have. And am I actually here just to hire people, like warm bodies? To actually go onto client site, or actually here to actually hire the emerging leaders for the future. And I think most organisations cannot answer that question.
It's the same in talent management
Yeah.
as well, though. So what you're normally trying to achieve is a succession plan. There's not necessarily something that says, did that succession plan succeed?
Yeah.
But what is really interesting, so I have a lot of conversations with lots of different businesses, and that conversation is normally how do we validate this 9-box grid, and how do we challenge the business on who those people are, because they are almost always the usual suspects, and they are almost always white men, which is just not helpful. So there's a lot of conversation going on. The challenge is that there isn't necessarily the targeted reason for making change, because effectively you've got to be a pretty brave talent leader to be the person who turns around and says, no, that person that you've probably promised a future here is not the right person for this role. Why? Well, because they did some assessment that told us that. It's like, well, yeah, but I see them work every day, and yeah, it's very, you've got to be very, very brave to have that fight internally, and it's not that there isn't that bravery, it's that it tends to fall on deaf ears.
We get a lot of resistance to succession planning talent sometimes at SAP because they don't like seeing who's snapping at their heels. They won't engage with it because they're intimidated by it.
They also won't develop them either. So if you've got that gap, especially going back to the diversity point, you have a succession plan that hits the D&I requirements. Yet you understand that you've got a development gap because of the ego involved with that. Quite often you can sit there for 3 years and nobody's done any bloody development with John.
Yeah.
And then when you do
Coming
have to
after
pull it out of the
yeah.
drawer, John's still not ready because no one's done everything.
So is that where so having done talent management and succession reviews, that's where you use the collective of your whole Xcode to keep everyone to account? So that's where you have the conversation, you have the review, you talk through what the needs are, the development gap, because there's always a development gap. And that's where talent management has to go in and check and recheck and actually get into a rhythm of the conversation.
And that's the handoff between TA and TM, isn't it?
It is, but
the two separate
it is, but that's where we need to be much more joined up. So
How
yes,
far
there
down
is
the org are we talking about? Just like succession to the board, or like what?
That's the key point, because it is about, that's why I started with all the CEO stats, because they're the horror stats, they're the ones that everyone gets sort of shown across the market. But if you're going to turn the dial on DEI, if you're going to get a different kind of leadership in that doesn't actually exist, you're actually thinking about, so how far down is this domino effect? And if we're going to get different skills in and we wait until there's an urgent executive search vacancy, you've then got a 6-month process plus notice periods plus before that fire is put out. This is where that kind of conversation I'm almost thinking now about, get those roles connected, get TD, TM and TA talking. How are you going to influence the board?
It has to go all the way down, right? Because you have to develop the bench, the talent bench, and you have people that have ended up from, say, being hired as an apprentice, and by accident they end up as a partner, right? And that has not been a planned route. That's just been a stealth mission of that person. So for me, it all needs joining up. So whenever, in the 9-box grid is a good example, right? So you have the 9-box grid, but yet in early careers we don't have a grid. We're now going to implement a 4-box grid, right? Which is about potential and leadership and that stuff. So it's like if you're not linking what great looks like at the top with what that in the early provision of recruitment, then you're always going to misfire because you're not hiring the right people. And I think it's like that honest conversation around what is it we're trying to solve, the problem that we're trying to solve, and it's a long-term problem because otherwise you're just going to be reacting all the time and just filling gaps.
Becky, how do you do that? Because not everyone's going to get, you don't want them all to be partners.
No, I know.
You want them to be good drones out on clients and things like that. Sometimes how do you get the mix right?
This is a good question, right? So I think first of all we need to hire the right potential, because what we were hiring were academic, the academic ability, and I think over the last 2 years that there was a real focus, there was a big review linking numeracy results to exam success, focus on exam pass rates and stuff. And what we did was hire very high IQ, but not high EQ. And we know that at exec level you need to have EQ and IQ, or passion, purpose, whatever. So we're now recalibrating back to potential. So let's bring a bit of EQ back, because what's happening 3 years on, post-hiring, there was big attrition, they're not moving into management roles, they didn't have the management readiness. So fundamentally we just didn't have that bench of talent moving up through, because we have to recognise that we are going to lose talent we hire, but we want the boomerangs back as well. So we actually want different sector experience to leave EY and come back at some point. So it's a good question, haven't solved it. I think what we need to do is have a leadership, like almost a leadership early careers programme, which we don't have, because we're very client driven, so we hire to service line, whereas we probably should have a leadership academy of different types of hires that would rotate across the business. But at the moment everyone's still focused in their silos. So I need somebody that's going to run P&L activity for this transactions project, as opposed to the grand design, which is actually a longer term strategy. But I think it's difficult to get businesses or CEOs invested.
Well, that's it.
Yeah.
So this is kind of why we sort of felt excited about talking today, and just because it's timely. So the pandemic has definitely shifted things. ESG is coming like a goods train, and what that's done for the first time is put talent, and therefore TA, on the radar of the board. So we've got investors now that are publicly stating, unless you can show real commitment to ESG, and by that we mean pay, we mean diversity, etc., etc., then we're going to pull our investment. So you've got the risk committee now really looking at talent, and it never was before. The board was finance, performance, markets, macroeconomics, and now it's looking at talent. So there's a real opportunity we're seeing from the conversations that we've been having that actually it is about TA. TA is not just executing the bombs on seats
Didn't they
anymore.
say that though? Didn't they say recently that they were not going to invest in companies that
Alliance,
didn't have...
yeah.
Like this is like a commitment that if they... So they fund lots of companies, and if they don't actually have a plan, then effectively there will be no investment vehicles.
There's a big rise in social procurement as
Yeah.
well. In trying to contract with businesses, more and more times we get very serious questions about what's your policies on these sorts of things, and where they were you always ask those questions, but they were never a risk of trading situation, but now they are. Now it's you need to send me, if it's confidential, you need to send me the front and the back page of stuff, and so it is becoming very, very serious in terms of businesses running.
Just one question on the ESG, if I may. In your experience with people with organisations that you speak to, who are the sponsors in those organisations of ESG? For us, it's our CPO, and then by nature it's me because I work for it. So, from that point of view, do you see it always being a people-led activity in organisations, or do you see it more broader within operations?
It does vary, and I
Okay.
think that's a cultural thing. So a lot of the times, and CHROs will talk to us and say, well, I've just been given ESG, I don't even know what it stands like, what's the G? So it does vary. I think what we're seeing increasingly now is it's part of board reporting.
Right.
So there is now, the risk committee seems to be taking it. So the CEO now has to start reporting monthly on what they're doing, and that absolutely has a people element, and therefore a huge chunk sits with Chief People Officer. But actually it's right across, and this is what we're seeing with the Alliance threat, is it's starting to be linked to exec pay. So in which case it is the CFO's job, etc., etc.
Okay.
So it is changing, and I think the pandemic probably it caught everybody by surprise because, funnily enough, we were all focusing on other things at the time. But so I think it will settle down. We're seeing more and more ESG roles being created, and everyone's after this ESG experience, and they're like, well, what do you mean by that? Because it's not a thing yet. So it is interesting, but CHROs definitely are
The drivers at the moment.
I think it depends a bit on the type of business.
Right.
So if you're in retail, the big focus will be about your supply chain. So actually then it might be commercial, coup, those kind of roles. I think it reflects a bit. But it's definitely part of the people agenda.
We have a proportion of our partner comp that is now linked to this.
Yeah.
So this will be the first time through REMCOM, so Remuneration Committee in the summer, that there will be a proportion to it. So I'm fascinated
One
to
of their
see how.
targets.
Sorry?
One of the targets, or what?
It varies depending on kind of where they are in the chain, but that then sort of goes beyond it then into great. That also then links into what people are doing around their contribution to talent, both in terms of acquisition and development. So it's, from my perspective, looking at that, it's brilliant, and I think a lot of people thought they were off the hook for having to get stuck in anymore.
Correct.
So you KPI them, or you relate their reward to how much they get involved in talent initiatives.
Yeah,
that's amazing. Does anyone else do that? Really?
Yeah.
We have DNI targets for PPs and above.
Okay, that's really interesting.
And also we started doing that piece around some talent initiatives from last year, and we're probably quite unusual in terms of the way we acquire talent for the law firm. So we, at the senior end, obviously we're interested in people's books of business and stuff like that. But if during that interview process there's somebody that we think is going to be wrong for us, it's a whole kind of arsehole test. If they fall down on that, it doesn't matter how big that book is, we won't do it. And that's been really powerful. So the way that we go through REMCOM, there are sort of 4 metrics that they're measured against, but if they fall down on that top people one, then actually you're limited then to what you can achieve in the other ones, and I think that's been quite a brave change, but a really important one. And I think if it's very subjective, of course, but if you look at the behaviours now that you witness from top down, it is much more collegiate, it's much more people focused, and I think most people want to do it, they see the value in it, but those who perhaps care a bit less have to do it now, or they're not going to get rewarded for it. So.
I mean, I think that's the way to get succession talent engaged by the business, is to make them have to do it rather than choose to do it.
I think for a lot of people, if it's not directly linked to them in a way that they're going to feel the pain if they don't do it, it just falls to the bottom of the pile. So, forces the agenda. Absolutely.
I think the biggest challenge I've seen coming from largely regulated industries where you have to have mandated succession plans is when it comes to the crunch. Number one, they always want an oven-ready turkey, not somebody with development areas. Number 2, they always want a bar raiser. So even if you've got somebody who may be an oven-ready turkey because you've developed them, they still want to go outside to see if they've got a bar raiser. And then number 3, if you've got an oven-ready turkey who you've maybe even made into a bar raiser, if the role's not there, they're ready to move on and you've lost them. So it's constant balancing act that's really difficult. And I've never seen internal succession being probably more than 10-15% successful at best, actually then ending up filling the roles.
Just to build on that, Katrina, I think this may go against the grain of the conversation, but when you operate at the group level, usually succession is just for Xcode and maybe the level below, and it just won't ever go beyond that because it becomes too complicated. You have to create an army, of process to try and look at it. So you just have to be realistic of what does your nominations committee actually want, what does or the whole board actually want. They want to know about your CEO succession, probably your CFO succession, and Xcode. Maybe they'll look at that, but beyond that, they're not going to want to look beyond that. So in terms of developing talent from within the organisation, then you have to think about more holistic capabilities you want to build for the future and skills you want to build for the future. And yes, you can have the leadership development that goes with that, but I think connecting the two becomes almost too difficult. And you can do your best effort, but actually some of it is down to individual ambition, some of it's down to good luck, some of it's down to timing. So actually trying to manage all of that becomes too complicated, so you just focus at the top.
Yeah, see at Lloyd's Register we have a rising talent programme, so we identify talent as a succession, but then we put them on the programme for a year or 2, and then after the 2nd year it's like, what next? And then they go, because we've just trained you, we've just developed you with all these skill sets, and then they're like, what?
So I think there's two things here, isn't there? 'Cause there's the general new set of skills, what are we after, ground up, and then there is the clear, obviously traditional, yeah, absolutely, succession planning, CEO, exco, and then that feeder layer, because that's often, if it's internal, that's where you've got the domino effect of the vacancy has to land somewhere. So I think what we're seeing now is the conversation starting to get more joined up. It's still at that senior layer that we're talking about, but there's an urgency now to bring these skill sets in, because all for years and years you've been grooming in a certain vision internally. And I think it is really interesting when you're sort of saying, the majority will failed internal and you're always bringing external in. A lot of other businesses, I think Teresa, did you say a lot of SAP succession is internal, because you're on this, you come into this, and that's probably more the bit that needs the mould breaking, because that assumption that somebody who's been on
I
a
find
career
that really
path.
challenging, to be honest. And at EY it is like that. It is very much an entitlement culture and kind of rite of passage, time spent in role as opposed to true value contribution. And I think that's in some ways it's actually quite challenging to manage that versus actually buying in talent, when you've got and also you could be sitting on great talent internally but they're not ready yet, to your point about bar raising, because perhaps they haven't had the external peripheral view, so it's always challenging.
But if you looked at succession planning like you looked at making people redundant, it would be much more robust.
Yeah.
Because I'm very well having this conversation, okay? But we're just about to go through an acquisition and acquire 15,000 people across the US. And I hear loads of people around the world, around the room, are going, 9 box. I'm looking at the 9 box and going, geez, that is not going to stand up in court, right? That is not going to, if I look at the potential rating, if I look at the PDR rating, if I look at this information. So it's not just the fact that you've got these tools or you're having these conversations and it's entitlement. If you treated it with the same robustness of standing up in court and defending that position, we'd be in a different place.
Well, I think it's looking at what the role needs, isn't it? And quite often in talent development, we look at individual skills and we look at people traits versus what does that, and I think this is what you were talking about, is what does that role need to be successful? What are the skills, what are the behaviours, and what's the difference from where we are today? And that's, how you defend it from a redundancy perspective, as opposed to they were good at that, they were good at that, they were good at this.
But it's the same risk.
Yeah.
It's the same risk,
Yeah.
and that's we're not treating it that way, are we? We're treating it, as I said, we're talking about succession planning. It's someone's name on a list. It's on 6 other lists that's going to disappear, and I've lost them. It's this. We sit down at the end of the year and we do our succession plan. Same name, or it's a woman, so she'll be on more.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know how many I'm on because I'm female, so I'm counted in a report that will say my succession is a certain rate. So I just think there's a robustness around this that's not there if you were facing the other side.
So we, famously in GE, some of you might remember, we used to have so the CEO succession was a 10-year competition run internally, fairly visibly. So if you were kind of on that list, and there was probably, started off with 5, and as the years went on it whittled down to the final 2, and they were given different challenging roles in different bits of the organisation to deliver on
Properly
with, they were groomed.
I've got a contrarian example.
I think it's a lot to do with the leadership mindset. So before Academy, I was chief people officer at the Hub Group, and I found in that set of blanket positions. We had some near-death experiences early on in the company as a startup in econ, and we hired at one point externally COO, CFO, CTO, and CMO at the same time. Partly after a near-death experience, and shareholders stepped in and said, hey, great founder, maybe you should get a proper management team. They crashed and burned pretty badly within 6 or 9 months. And that was a sort of line in the sand, and Matt said, well, from this point on, every single person on the management team will have to be internally promoted. We're just going to go with people we've seen in action in our culture. And we're a business growing at 50 to 100% a year, started at 10 million turnover, ended up 2 billion, from 50 to 5,000 people. And so we started to hire hundreds and hundreds of grads, incredibly smart, high potential, high IQ, high EQ. And it's this idea, if you're joining a company, we're in this high growth phase, so you could have an extraordinary career, and it may end up that you sort of cross the chasm and become one of the sort of senior team, at an age that's sort of not the norm. But to do that, if you want to keep jumping up, every time you do that, you've got to have a successor in each one of your roles. And we created an enormous talent succession culture in the organisation. You just couldn't be considered for progression unless you had extraordinary talent in your team that were ready to step up. And that sort of company-wide mindset to talent was extraordinary.
Can I ask, in this room, we're all leaders, who's got a successor in their team? Like, if you got hit by a bus tomorrow, has anybody got one?
Yeah.
Because I look at mine and I think, actually, God bless them.
That's not a good comment in itself. God bless them. Was that filmed?
Mine was forced by mat leave. So we were lined up to get somebody in to cover mine, and then the business said, actually, this was pandemic, we're going to pull funding for it. What's going to happen, Sarah? You sort it out. Right, okay. So one of mine had to step up and really step up, and we carved out my role into 4 bits, but she took a big chunk of it. And she's done a really good job, but it was because she could focus on a smaller part, but quite intensively. But without me not being there, she wouldn't have had that chance. So it's a strange sort of turn of events, but we don't routinely do that for people. We don't give them the chance to just focus in on something and really develop the skills with the space to do it. So yeah, I'm lucky to have it, but...
Is that because that's how things have always been done?
Well, law firm, we like to do it that way, don't we?
But there's nothing stopping you, really, from giving people a chance in your team?
There's nothing stopping me from doing it, no, and we now have done it, and so we are sort of replicating that in
so
other
then all of us can
pockets.
do it then. So exactly. So there's no reason why, even if they've got whatever 50% of salaries, you can give them the extra 50%. Let them know.
Yeah, I'm trying to instill this project culture in my team. Yeah, that's fun. Because I feel like succession planning is about extra stuff that you're doing, right? That's pushing the envelope. That you're making you're making a unique impact in your role, your BAU, but also you're doing extra curricular stuff, and that's going to kind of round you off. And I think it's difficult, isn't it, when we're all busy to try and create, particularly in TA, the capacity and elasticity of the team to get them to
That's
do.
what every business.
Yeah.
I
think the more busy you are, the easier it is.
Well, I agree, but I'm on the journey, so every person in my team has got a project, right? So it's instilling this project culture, but for those individuals, they kind of, with the entitlement culture, they're thinking, well, why do I need to work on extra projects? In the past, I would have just moved upwards, whereas I'm saying, no, in the new world, we need to have projects, TA projects, transformation projects, which will allow you to step up and move onwards, because I need to see the difference between being in a BAU role and actually adding value to the team, moving in a different direction.
Yeah,
everybody wants a high.
I just make the point, sorry, just in terms of, it's an accountancy there, and we're talking about lawyers, and from my understanding, when you are a graduate lawyer or accountant, you have to work, as a qualified accountant or lawyer, you will have at some point had to work with a qualified accountant or lawyer to become skilled in your role enough to pass the, I can't remember what it's called,
Yeah, I'm just talking about my recruiters, not accountants, so actually my team. So as a team, it's like I'm focusing on the succession plan for my team and my role, but what I have to do is enable the team to have projects. To Sarah's point, is what extra can they work on in order to expand their vision, knowledge, external viewpoints, in order to get them to lift upwards. And so
it doesn't start and end with a talent function, does it? I
agree. I completely agree. But for me personally, in the recruitment team, it's about culture shift, isn't it? It's kind of that culture change around how succession planning isn't just about putting people in a grid, right? It's about what contribution is that person going to make in terms of their own career development. So that culture shift is quite a difficult one to try to embed in an organisation that perhaps hasn't had that before.
I think it's the operational versus the strategic bit, isn't it? Because a lot of the team could be too operational, and they don't get an opportunity to
Exactly.
then
Absolutely.
step up.
But so what you're experiencing is what every other business area, business unit would experience.
Exactly.
And that's and then you're leaving a hole somewhere if you do donate somebody to a project or if you do move them on to this. So a lot of the, and this is brilliant because I knew this would happen. So I don't think we're going to have time for the round table because it's been a round room, which is absolutely fine. And we kind of covered that top point. So it was starting to think about, again, thinking about TA and the role of TA as external talent, predominantly. So getting involved in that conversation sooner about succession planning, and yes it is, it's more that senior layer coming down maybe 3 rather than the ground up piece. I'd be really interested in, Teresa's obviously given a great example of the sourcing element of your TI team that is there to build that relationship with future talent. So it's there, it's ready, it can sit on an external succession plan and mirror or support or complement an internal succession plan. I'd be curious to know amongst the room how many of your organisations are genuinely thinking about that kind of external view of succession planning, and then looking at when can we bring them, can we even start bringing some of this new talent that we need in from, let's say, -3 into a -1 layer and be really brave. We've got some clients that are really challenging themselves on that because that layer's not diverse, that layer's not global, that layer's not thinking about ESG, this layer is. How brave can we be?
In the current market, my God, I mean, we're talking about now levels of roles. I mean, I've got 12,500 vacancies, we've got people on 60 recs open, and you're having those kinds of conversations, you know, you haven't, unless you've got a separate function sourcing, those TA people are never going to be doing any of this pipelining stuff.
No.
They're just not going to.
But
It's nice to
is this
have.
the time to get the business case more for the nice to have?
Maybe,
Because
but
it's
that
becoming
top, you're
more and
talking
more
3
critical.
levels down. You know, the most you're going to get is a heat map. The most you're going to get in a large organisation is we have a trouble with digital marketing. We have trouble in Asia Pac in this particular country. You'll have to go strategically into where there's real pain in order to build that case study. You're not going to get a nice 3-level down domino effect for the majority of these positions.
Unless you use tech.
Just if I have that conversation, they're going to laugh at me because Sarah, fill the vacancies that are there. Yeah. So I think this is good, but it needs to kind of focus again, like on risk. What is the risk of promoting the wrong person? And what is the result for the retention point of the problem? It has to come back to the impact for those operational people at the front line running their businesses.
I had a conversation yesterday with I was trying to think whether I can even say the sector without giving it away, but it was a big pharma company who have just done succession, and it's well publicised, and the CEO's retired, and it's been an internal exercise, so it's brilliant. 2 things about this organisation. In a restructured area, which is probably 4 layers down, they knew they had flight risk, they knew they were reorganising, and that was going to create new skills needed. They were going to create sort of split roles in half, and therefore they needed more headcount. And we helped them with a talent mapping exercise so that they could go to the business, go, yeah, great, you want these skills, but they don't exist here, they exist over there. So that needs to change. So all of that was super proactive. The same company then has got 50% of its ex-co turning over because only one got the top job and the others have left. And so when I said to them, hey, how's your 2022 starting? Oh my God, and this is the exec search, oh my God, we're so busy because this has happened. So they've got the business willing to be really proactive and sensible and thinking about the future and the skill sets and how do we bring them in there. And then we're completely napping at the top. So that's a business case because that is so much pain for that organisation. That's the business case to potentially, but this is what I wanted to start today as a debate on whether your organisations are ready yet, and at what point can you start to potentially bring much more of an engine room into that external talent, because it takes the pain, it takes that immediacy, go fill this, go do it, it's kind of order taking piece that you've been talking about earlier today. So.
To your point on that, I think 53% of companies in you surveyed don't do this. Of the 47%, I suspect many will be a tick box exercise. They do the work, but to your point and your point, they don't follow through on reality. And there are some companies out there who do this well, not many, but the ones who do, it's an embedded part of the culture from the top.
So
one of the questions was where does TA get involved? Mark and I used to work together, and one of the things that we had quite consistently in that organisation was in those talent reviews that only happen once a year, the TA partners that owned different areas, and I don't mean directors, I mean, you know, I look after tech in this space, sat in talent reviews. So they weren't owning it, they weren't driving it, but they had very clear visibility in understanding what was happening, what are the plans, how are the business thinking, and then as they hire elsewhere, they're able to influence, flag up talent. So it's a small connection,
but it's important, because I think this is where I was really curious to sort of see where each organisation was, because for some it's just so separate that even that is a huge jump forward, because you've got the leadership or whoever it is in the business going, great, well we want diverse, of course, we want digital skills, we want online thinking, we want all of this stuff, and if it doesn't exist, but you know it's coming, that's where you can start thinking about, you know, we need to be doing this, and it hasn't reached that signal point yet. So it's TA having the seat at the table when all of this leadership stuff is being discussed, then starts to cascade down through what you're looking for, your teams are looking for.
We've just created a newish role, so we don't really have HR VPs. I don't know why, we just don't. But we've now got 6 what we call senior talent partners who are similar level to my role. They each partner with a different area of the business, specifically with the exec and their team, so CEO and 2 levels down. And they are that bridge, I guess, between TA and the exec. And so we're now starting to drive those quarterly talent reviews, looking at succession planning, but really with that view of where have we got internal that we know we've got some development, and how can we work with L&D to fix that, and then how do we work with our resource manager to make sure that we can do the external pipelining now in advance of that. I think the challenge is that it's a new role, and they're really struggling with that breadth of, it isn't just about the individuals and where we look at the gaps and where do we need to develop people, it's then having to drive the L&D curriculum with support from L&D. It's having to think about the reward structure and do we need to change that. So the breadth of their role is quite big for actually quite a large number of people. So we're now thinking, do we need to expand that to more? But that seems to be working quite well. So we're ahead of the curve on some challenges. We always get the curveball, so there'll always be something. But it's helping drive that conversation and getting it firmly on the agenda of the execs when they're having those conversations.
That sounds. What you just described sounds like a strategic HR business partner job.
Well,
so,
I mean,
so
but without all the noise of some of the other stuff.
Yeah, so I just think it's, you know, what can we do as a TA community is, you know, make sure when we're hiring within our own HR function to hire those types of individuals with that level of capability and influence, the leadership with our own function to make sure that we're getting that calibre of individual that can have those sorts of conversations and bring TA, bring learning, whoever, bring reward into the conversation at the right time, and elevate that job completely away from what I would call the HR manager or the more junior business partner, sort of transactional type role within HR. So
our most recent hire is not from HR into that role, she's a strategist. Nothing to do with HR, just need to understand HR, but it's purely thinking about strategy. So we'll see how that goes.
No, that's great. So we did an exercise in explaining with the CEO and CHRO where we looked at internal movement within the organisation and how did those people do. And we saw that basically the bigger the move, the faster they're promoted, the longer they stay. So if we looked at people who moved across teams, they go through so much. People who moved across geographies grew more. People who moved across functions grew, really. But it's taken that confidence to say you're a good strategist. We're going to put you in HR for this reason. And many companies don't have that boldness about them. You see that
bravery. Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder now whether there's a tipping point. Something has to change because everybody is after the same thing. And if it doesn't exist that much, you've got to start thinking about how you get there differently, sooner, braver, maybe. How are we doing for time? 1 minute?
1 minute.
Then that's it. I'll stop. That's fine. No round table because it was a round room, so that's brilliant. I hope you found it interesting. And yeah. good influencing.